welcome to another edition of On the Town. I'm your host, Ed Edelson. On the Town is a series of interviews with leaders who help to make Southbury a great place to live, raise a family, own a business, and retire. Today our guest is Arthur O'Neill, our representative to the Connecticut Legislature's General Assembly. In addition, he's a well-known lawyer practicing in Southbury and many of the towns around us. Representative O'Neill, thank you for taking the time to visit with us today. Let me first congratulate you on your recent election victory. But before we talk about your work as a legislator and the challenges of being a legislator in Hartford, maybe we can begin a little bit with your early years.
Sure.
I understand you born and raised in Southbury, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about the early days.
Sure. Well, you had asked about pictures of Southbury and going back to the olden days, kind of. So I thought I'd bring some photos. This is a picture of my grandparents.
Okay.
It's one of the few pictures I have of them.
Any idea what year we're talking about
Probably
here?
1928 or 1929,
Okay.
somewhere in there. It was around the time that shortly before my mom was born. And they're standing in front of, if you can see in the background, is a car. And I'm pretty sure this was taken in Southbury.
Okay.
I'm not absolutely certain, but I'm pretty sure that it was taken in
But
Southbury.
they were Southbury residents? Were
Yeah,
they the first of your family to come to Southbury?
Yes. My grandparents had the farm where the high school is now located.
Okay.
And actually, part of it was on the other side of the street where the Wyndham Hotel is now located.
Okay.
So they had both sides of the street there, and it went up along Judd Road, again to where the
Right.
school is located. And so my grandmother owned the farm. She married my grandfather in, I think it was 1926 or 27. I don't remember exactly when. So this is an old picture, so to speak. You can't really tell much about Southbury except that it had trees, which it still does.
Okay.
But not nearly as many as it used to. And then, let's see. I guess in chronological order, sort of, as far as my history is concerned. This is my parents.
So just to be clear, you were, okay, well, start with your parents, right?
My
Okay.
parents. So I'm giving you a little bit of the lineage.
You haven't come into the picture yet.
No, I'm not in this picture. I'm not in this picture. This is their wedding picture.
And, early or 1940s, you think, or?
No, I know exactly
Yeah.
when. This was in July of 1951.
Okay.
Is when they got married, and came to live in Southbury shortly thereafter. I had a picture of my mother's parents, so I tried to find one of my father's parents, and so those are his parents,
Okay.
and that's me at an early age. So
I'd recognize you.
you're right, anytime, right. And then, given the season that we are in, this is sort of the obligatory
Right.
visit to a department store and sitting on a department store Santa Claus's lap at probably age 4 or something like that. So
Right.
I'm giving you my life in pictures, so to speak.
As far as you know, that would have been in Waterbury, that you
Yeah.
would have gone to such a department store?
Pretty sure it would have been in the old Howland Hughes,
Right, okay.
which is getting a little bit of attention now because
Right.
it's being renovated. But that was the big department store in Waterbury and in this area. That's where they would go shopping. Because I always associated positive sentiments with Christmas and diesel fumes. Because when you went to Waterbury, they had all the big trucks that were delivering things, and so whenever I smell diesel fumes, I think Christmas.
Okay.
It's an unusual association. I agree. So this is a photograph of my first grade class. I managed to find this one,
All right.
dig it out, and then I'm not sure what the prize would be, but if you can pick me out of this photograph, or I can show it to the folks at home and they can take bets. Maybe we can put like dollar figures on each picture,
Okay.
sort of like a lottery ticket or something like that.
Well, we'll see if we can get a good image of that on the screen, and people
Yeah.
can, it could become a new parlor game.
Yeah. Pick the legislator out of the first
Future
picture.
legislator.
Future legislator, right? So
But that, when it says Southbury Consolidated School, that
Mhm.
was what we call
Right.
Gainfield
which
today.
now call Gainfield, right?
Now, given where the farm is,
Mhm.
now that was a bus ride for you at
There
that
was
time?
a bus ride. from the far edge of Southbury, because the farm, school is located on the Southbury-Middlebury town line,
Right.
along the shores or banks of the 8 Mile Brook. So that was like a half hour, 40 minutes, depending, because the bus, of course, had to make a lot of stops along the way. And there are a number of people in this picture who are still in Southbury, and so I can point out a few of them. I'll just tell you some of the names. There's Peter Betty is in this picture. Gail
Okay.
Sympathy is in this picture. She's now in McCloskey.
Okay.
Her husband used to work for the town hall for many years. And she was a school teacher. And Bill Bragg is, now he lives in Watertown, but his mother lived in Southbury for a very long time.
Okay.
And his father was a doctor who worked at the training school.
Hmm.
So
Makes sense.
a lot of the people in this picture had some kind of connection to the training school, because that was where a fairly significant chunk
Right.
of
That
the
was quite a
population lived.
center of employment. You bet.
Right. So, I don't know, maybe I
If I
should.
could just go back to the
Mhm.
farm for a second, was it a dairy farm, like so many
Yes.
around here?
Mhm,
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I actually have a photograph that sort of confirms that. But I'm going to do a spoiler here. That's me.
Oh, no, we're gonna edit that out.
I don't look that way that much anymore. I used to have blonde hair.
The term of art of the consolidated schools
Mhm.
was the idea, close down all these one-room schoolhouses, and with better transportation, we can build what's now
Right.
Gainfield or
Yeah.
eventually Rochambeau, and
Right.
bring many students together.
Right, so they closed down all of those little district schools. There's a map that's available that shows Southbury chopped up in 1860s or something. Each of the school districts is identified and the school is located. So you had White Oak and you had the Bullet Hill School, and there was a school down in Southford that's actually one that my mother went to, because by that time there was no Strongtown School anymore. That district had ceased to exist. So this is another shot of the farm, and you can see the buildings. This gives you a pretty good, like I say, the barn. This was a stable where we had the animals, and so you can see all of the farm buildings that, or not all of them. There's some others that are out of the picture here, but just to give you an idea of what it used to look like.
But you, I'm assuming growing up, you were doing the farm chores every day.
Well, by the time I came along, we still had the farm. Well, there's the land, and again, you
Okay.
can see, but there's those black and white objects there.
Right.
Those are cows.
Okay.
That we were renting it out to people who actually were
Oh,
dairy
okay.
farmers. Back in the 40s, my grandfather died in 1937 as a result of a car accident, and my grandmother then went to Waterbury to live. She had a small grocery store there, and so she was operating out of the grocery store and renting the farm out
I see.
pretty much during World War II period of time. And then it just was where she would basically, she wasn't working the farm, and we weren't really working the farm either. Although I do have a photo, I guess is another one sort of showing the buildings, and
Right.
again, I don't know how much of this is visible.
Well, again, we'll try to scan that and,
Okay, great.
hopefully I can sort through these.
Yeah. Figure out which ones are which. But you get a sense of it was a fairly large complex of
Right.
buildings. It wasn't just one little building.
But clearly you grew up with not a neighbor 50 feet down the road. It's a pretty
Right.
big piece of land
Yeah.
that I'm aware of today, just from the high school, and as
Mhm.
you say, the hotel across the street.
Right. There was one of the things my grandmother did was she sold. That's me on a horse. I think that's a Davy Crockett hat I'm wearing. Anyway,
I had one of
the
them.
barn with the barn in the background. Now I did do some things involving cattle. This is a picture of me. What happens sometimes is that a heifer will leave behind one of her offspring,
Okay.
abandons it, and I found one abandoned, and so we brought it back to the house basically, and I spent probably a year or so raising, and you can see me feeding
Right.
this.
With
This
a
is probably
bottle,
a few
yeah.
weeks after it was born.
All right.
And one of the things I did was I raised her, and her name was Lady Lee.
All
So,
Clearly left an impression on you.
right, yeah, it was my first sort of nurturing experience, I guess. that one. But, so moving along, finally getting, what showed you the picture from college, or rather from first grade. This is a picture from high school, the graduation picture.
And in your time, that was what we call Rochambeau today, in terms
Right.
of the building.
Yeah, that was the then Southbury High School, and I was in
Okay.
the last graduating class from Southbury High School, because it was right after that that they changed the name to Pomperaug High School in, it was 1971 or 72, I'm pretty sure.
But before the new building. They
Oh,
just
yes, yeah,
renamed it
yeah.
as Pomperaug High
Right,
School.
right, before the new
Okay.
building.
Huh.
Let's see. So high school led to college, and college led to graduation, so
And
that's
that was University of Connecticut?
University of Connecticut Stores. At that time, I had a beard, so I don't have a beard anymore, but that's what
Okay.
I looked like with the beard. And
Now, did you, I don't want to get too far ahead in the story, but are you studying like political science?
Right. Mhm.
So you already have an interest in political science and law, I'm thinking, but also
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
are you thinking about serving as a legislator at that point? Or
yeah.
is that not,
Yeah.
it's a consideration?
Well, it's an interest in politics. I'm going to show you this one. Is like, this is, I don't know if you can recognize the person there, or he signed it for us.
Okay,
But this was during the family trip to Washington, D.C. in August of 1968.
okay.
And we went to visit our congressman. And so
I couldn't make out the name, but.
Tom Meskel,
Meskel, okay.
because in those days Southbury was part of the old 6th District, and Congressman Meskel, who was from New Britain, was the U.S. representative there. He was originally elected in '66 and reelected in '68.
Mhm.
He then went on to run for governor in 1970 and served one term as governor, and then he was appointed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals.
Okay,
Sort of interesting circular events was that he came to Heritage Village at the 40th anniversary of the village and was the sort of guest speaker,
Okay.
because Heritage Village really got going when he was in Congress, and then really started being fully occupied when he was governor.
yeah,
So he was sort of associated with the beginnings of Heritage Village in one way or another. He used to play golf once in a while at the golf course. So anyway, they had him come and visit, and I got to sit next to him and chat with him, and of course he had no recollection of this photograph. But this isn't quite like the picture of Bill Clinton and John F. Kennedy at the White House, but
it's the same idea. Well, it made an impression on you, I think
Right,
is what
it-
you're saying.
yeah, I mean, seeing him and seeing what went on there, and watching politics from afar, and then getting to see people when they are,
Okay.
engaged. And so I don't know if that's enough of the photographs of
The early years.
the old,
But did
old days.
you immediately after college go to law school, or there
Yes.
was?
Mhm.
So again, you were pretty, moving on a certain trajectory that you
Mhm.
knew would lead to that. And law school was also University of Connecticut, I believe?
No, law school was Rutgers in New Jersey.
Oh, yes, that's right.
So I left Connecticut for a while and was living down south, as I saw it.
Right.
People in
Relatively speaking.
the rest of the country don't think of New Jersey as the South, but
Right.
if you're from New England, it is. So that's kind of how I got started, and I have involvement in local politics, and I got involved in campaigns. I actually was a volunteer for Congressman Meskel when he ran later for
Okay.
governor in 1970, and in a very minor sort of way, put up some signs and that sort of thing. And
But
so
your first
that's how it got
campaign
started.
is in, what year was your first campaign?
I first ran for state representative in I've got a photograph here of the newspaper clipping, in 1988, in February. The sequence of events was that the then incumbent state representative was a lady named Carol Herskowitz.
Mhm.
She ran for first selectman, which when she won, it created a vacancy when she resigned the office of state representative, and that was produced a special election in February. So this is the headline that was in the Waterbury paper. It was front page, which is pretty good ink, and a nice color photograph.
Yeah, that's a great picture of you.
And so that was my first election campaign. And the margin was 223 votes, which the newspaper report called it a close number, and in terms of numbers, it was relatively close. But It was 10%. So, it was a relatively solid win for a special election. It's kind of not unusual for
Oh, right, because
specials.
Carroll is stepping down in,
Right.
on an odd year, if you will.
Yeah, and
But
it's
you're-
a much lower turnout than
Right.
most elections. So, and there,
And was the district the same back then? Part of
No.
Southbury, Bridgewater?
it was substantially the same. It was Southbury, Roxbury, and Bridgewater, but in those days there was New Milford. And actually New Milford, because it had grown so much since the previous redistricting, by
Okay.
1988, there were almost as many voters in New Milford as there were in Southbury. And in fact, the district was either the second or third largest, maybe even the largest district in the state, and it was overpopulated.
Okay.
And Southbury had grown, and New Milford had grown as well. So it needed to shrink in the subsequent redistricting, and it did, which is how the town of Washington was put in, and the town of New Milford was taken out of the
Taken out.
district to
Okay.
balance it off. So,
All right. They have one of those,
yeah.
that didn't happen in 1988, did it?
No, no. Well, there
No-
were
no
cell
phone-
phones, but I didn't have one in my pocket, that's for
Okay.
sure. So,
That's-
that's how I got started. And
Well, it's pretty exciting, I'm sure, for you back then.
yeah, well, you campaign, running around your first time especially, it's always, the most exhilarating one in a lot of ways, and everything is new and fresh. Although I'd worked on other people's campaigns over
Right.
the years and that sort of thing, so I had an idea of what it was like. But until you're the candidate, you don't really get it.
I agree 100%. But now, there you go, up to Hartford. Was it what you expected? Were there any surprises in terms of what the position entailed?
Yes. Nothing really prepares you for, unless you worked there, or maybe if you were
Right.
on your staff, or you were a lobbyist, or maybe you were related to someone, if you were married to a legislator or the child of a legislator, so you
Right.
kind of saw a lot of it up close and
right.
personal. But you don't really understand the time commitments that are involved, or the kinds of issues that are going to come to people, bring to you, and the kinds of questions and the problems and so forth. And also, there, in those days, and perhaps to an outsider now, it would still, if there's a newly elected person who's going to look at it and say, this is crazy. I just saw a clip or a bit of Shahana Hayes, was just elected to Congress.
Right. U.S.
And-
Congress, yes.
And she was on a TV show, and she was talking about it, and she was basically, her attitude was, this in effect is crazy, because they were using paper ballots for her first vote. I'm assuming it was the vote for picking a speaker
Okay.
within the Democratic caucus in DC. But her reaction is that they're so much antiquated, and how do they possibly
Right.
do this in this modern age, do things this old-fashioned way, and that sort of thing. And there's a little bit of that. I have to say, my initial reaction was, this is crazy. I mean,
Okay.
this whole system. But over time, whether you just get used to it, like you break in a new pair of shoes, either you break the shoes or the shoes break you.
Okay.
It's not clear, but
Right.
but you get used to a certain way that things
Right.
have to be done a certain way, and you develop a facility for making the whole thing work for you, and it all begins to make sense.
Okay.
And I would say that, as I say, my initial reaction the first months that I was there, that first year, was that, wow, this is no way to run a railroad, or an airline, or a shipping line, or anything, really. This just doesn't, everything here is done in some sort of chaotic and disorganized and unfocused sort of way that, it's amazing that anything gets done. But part of this is a function of 187 people have to work together, and then you have the governor, and then you have to deal with the bureaucracy, and of course there are procedures that you're supposed to follow, and then you have sort of the real rules versus the written rules kind of thing, the unwritten rules
Right.
that frequently are more important than the ones that are part of the rule book. But getting a sense of how that works it takes time, but once you do it, then it does all seem to sort of make sense.
As an outsider, one of the activities that seems so crazy to me is the way things happen during the last couple of days of a legislative session, where things can wind up in bills that people
Right.
seem to say, I don't know where that came from.
Yeah.
Has, in your couple of decades here, has that gotten, in your opinion, worse, or you saw that right at the beginning and that was part of the craziness you're referring to?
Well, that was always part of it. I think when I first got there, committees had a lot more decisive say, as it
Okay.
were. If a committee chairman said, I'm not bringing out Bill X, or if the committee voted to kill a bill in committee, that was frequently the end of the bill. Now, anything can be brought back to life by way of an amendment, but at that time, in 1988, 89, 90, things were still pretty much governed by the sense that the committees actually had a function, part of which was to prevent things from getting to the floor and sort of act as gatekeepers for a lot of legislation. Starting in 1989, there was a new speaker. The speaker was a fellow named Richard Balducci. He was elected by a coalition of Republicans and Democrats who didn't like Herb Stahlberg running for a third term as speaker. That began to kind of undo the sense of discipline and organized chaos. Sort of
Okay.
it became somewhat more disorganized as chaos. And so there has been a weakening of the ability to say a bill is dead. You know, the committee voted against it, somebody tried to revive it in the Senate, they killed it, so why are you calling an amendment now? Well, people just go ahead and call amendments on almost anything, and so there's a more porous aspect to it. Now, there's good and bad to that. I mean, part of it is there's some good ideas that a small group of people decide they want to try to kill for whatever reason, and if you could have a majority in favor of something and yet it never gets a chance to be voted on. But on the other hand, and I think to a greater extent, there are a lot of questionable ideas that get brought up because someone is just constantly pushing, and they keep bringing things up long after it's clear that they're not going to really have much success with an idea.
You know, I've always wanted to get an answer to this question. I'm not sure you'll have a good answer. But, you know, when we look at the U.S. legislature, there's a clear distinction between the Senate and the House. And the first thing that comes to mind is a 6-year term versus a 2-year term. But within Hartford, within the legislature, both senator and representative are on a 2-year cycle, if you will. And as a result, I sometimes wonder, well, what's the real difference between a senator's responsibility in Hartford versus a representative, other than the geography that they're representing? They serve on committees together. It's not like you have a separate Senate committee and a separate representative committee. That, I think I'm right about this. They're almost all combined. So maybe a little tutorial on what's the difference.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, in terms of in the U.S. Senate, for example, it's obviously longer terms, smaller body, and senators deal with things like judges, which the U.S. House doesn't, ambassadors, cabinet appointments, et cetera. All of that sort of thing about appointments is handled in the U.S. Senate. Treaties go through the U.S. Senate, they don't go through the House, so that there's a different kind of work that goes on in each of the two chambers. In the legislature, the Connecticut legislature, and I would say most legislatures around the country, that is not the case. Both chambers usually vote on pretty much everything, not just budgets, which in Washington, obviously, the senators have to vote on the budget as well as the House. But there is a difference, I suspect, in perspective, in that if you're the state representative from Hartford and that's all you represent, your view of things is going to be different than a state senator who perhaps has to include West Hartford as part of their district and part of Hartford and maybe other towns as well, so there's a broader range. But you know, I think in reality, one could raise a question as to why you have two chambers. Now, there is a little bit of the Madisonian cooling off, give people a chance to have a second or third look at things, and sort of have the Senate be one group that functions one way, and the House be a somewhat different group. One of the big differences functionally between the two houses in Connecticut is that in the House, we frequently have extensive debates. And in the state Senate, they frequently have very brief debates on issues. Now, in recent years, that's been a bit different. There's been a bit more debating in the Senate. But if you go back and look at the legislative history of a bill that passed 25 or 30 years ago, or even 15 years ago, what you'll frequently see is the Senate passed the bill on consent. It passed 36-0 or 35-0 or something like that. There was no debate about the bill in the Senate. And the only place where you can find about what this bill is supposed to do. If there's some ambiguity or somebody says, well, the intention of the legislature was to do X, Y, or Z, the only place you're going to find any debate is on the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, you'll see something maybe in a committee hearing where there was an explanation as to what this bill was supposed to do, but since many bills get radically changed by an amendment on the floor of one or the other houses,
Right.
there frequently is no connection between what was heard at the public hearing
Right.
and people said, what we want this bill to do is X, Y, and Z, and then the final bill, the language is tremendously different in many cases. So from the standpoint of sort of understanding what legislation is supposed to do, the House does, I think, spend a lot more time vetting things and does it in a more public way. It's more transparent. The way the Senate works, everything is decided in caucuses. And when you have, as they did this past 2 years, you have 18 Republicans and 18 Democrats, or that's an extremely unusual circumstance, but 19 of one or 17 of the other, you get everybody into a room around basically a conference table, and it's a smallish group, and they have their conversations in those closed door meetings. And then somebody from each group gets together and they have a little conversation to decide what they want to do, the two leaders, for example, of the two caucuses. And then they come out and vote, and everybody says this is a great bill, ought to pass. And they don't tell you what the bill's about or what's in it or why they need it or anything. The House, because of so much larger number, such larger number of people, you can have those kinds of conversations, but you really are going to have people who want to talk about what this bill is for and why are we doing this?
Right.
What's the reason behind it?
So just curious, if somebody said to you, or if we fast forward 20 years into the future, you're sitting around talking about the old days in the legislature, and somebody said, well, what's your favorite story about something that happened to you or that you were involved with in the legislature? Is there one or two that sort of popped to the top of being, gee, that was memorable?
Well, yes. I actually brought another clipping to go with that. The thing that, if I am going to be remembered much for being a legislator,
Well, I think you will be, but
it's probably the first paragraph of my obituary is going to say something about that I was the co-chair of the impeachment committee that investigated John Rowland when he was being investigated by the federal government for various activities that involved taking gifts ultimately turned out of significant value, and then public policy changed around. And so this is probably the most, in terms of to the world at large, I guess, this is the thing that happened that I was involved in, that where I played a pivotal role that was important.
how long did those hearings go on?
Well, we created the committee in January of 2004, and at the beginning of June of 2004, Governor Rowland resigned rather than testify in front of the committee. The actual hearings probably lasted for about a month, 6 weeks. I don't remember the exact
That was
date.
all the preparation and just doesn't, you call it and next day everybody shows up.
Yeah, because we don't have the kind, the Committee of Inquiry, which is what it was technically called, but it was like a much longer title, to evaluate or investigate the issue of whether Governor Rowland should be impeached or not. That was like the full title. But the Committee of Inquiry, first we had to organize the committee, we had to create a space to do this, because we don't have a committee that really would do this. In Washington, they have the Judiciary Committee, and it would go to them. But anytime we've had this kind of an issue to come up, we had one previously involving a probate judge in the mid-1980s, and then the one involving Rowland. And so we have to create the committee from scratch, basically. It becomes almost like a third branch of the legislature. We had our own room. They set it up, special seating arrangements and so forth. We had to hire staff. We ended up hiring a law firm that had experience, where the people involved had experience dealing with impeachment issues, and was an out-of-state law firm. And so at one time we had 23 lawyers and 12 private investigators working for us, which was a larger number than the U.S. Attorney's Office had working on the case. Now, of course, they had years and years to do stuff. We were trying to get it wrapped up as quickly
Right.
as possible. So in order to get it done more quickly, we put more people to work.
Now, you're a pretty humble person, but I'm seeing that headline and I'm thinking that was an honor by your peers. Well, I'm thinking it
Yeah.
was. Now I don't know. Maybe it was.
Well, it was-
nobody else wanted it, but I'm thinking that's a pretty high-profile position.
Yeah.
That's quite a recognition by your peers that you had the wherewithal and the confidence of them to take this on.
I believe that's the case. So the fellow who was really instrumental in appointing me was the minority leader, Bob Ward, and he said something just recently as he was retiring from he'd been an auditor of the state of Connecticut. They did a big interview with him, and he said one of the most, and I'm just saying this, and maybe I'm not humble, but he said he always felt that one of the most important and best decisions he ever made was to appoint me to be the chairman of that, co-chairman of that committee. And it, by the way, was a bipartisan, equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, even though there were a lot more Democrats in the legislature at that time than Republicans in the House.
Well, I think you should feel pretty good by that comment.
Yeah,
I mean, and this is whatever, I'm losing track, 14 years later, that he not only thought it was important then, but looking back, made that
Yeah.
observation. Well, if you don't mind, let's, I'm sure there are more stories, but wanted to give our viewers a little bit of your thoughts about what's coming up, and maybe explain to them first this idea of the long session and the short session, so they
Sure.
understand the difference between the legislative sessions that we have.
Yeah. The long session is the one that starts in January and ends in June. It's about 5 months in total duration when the legislature is actually in session. That's mandated by the Constitution. The short session is the one that starts in February and ends in May. It's supposed to be only about 3 months. The short session was created largely as an effort to have the legislature more actively involved in managing the budget, because we had when these were created, we had a 2-year budget cycle. We then went to a 1-year budget cycle. So the short session really became a session. And as one of the big distinctions between the long and the short, besides the number of months that they're in session, is that in the long session, an individual legislator can introduce a bill on any topic. And so if you want to change the laws governing towns and what powers municipalities have, you can do that, or education, you can do that. In the short session, the individual legislators can only introduce bills that have to do with either spending money or raising taxes. So they're supposed to be budget focused in the short session. Now the reality is that the committees can raise any bills they want in either session.
Okay.
And so the individual legislator's ability to introduce legislation is really, in many ways, not nearly as important as the ability of the committees to do it, because if a
Right.
committee decides that it wants to do a bill, that's halfway towards the bill becoming law.
Yeah.
And or at least getting a bill hearing, and that's a big step in the direction of becoming law. So the distinction is, it's there, but it's not as important as it once was, because I think, again, as I said before, the committees tend to be much more expansive in their view of what they're supposed to be doing. And so the long session, short session distinction is frequently
Right.
lost, especially because we frequently have been going into special sessions
Right.
that go
So
on for
the
a
short
long
session's
time.
gotten longer and longer.
Right, and for example, the budget in 2017, we were in session all the way up till October of 2017.
Yeah.
So that was not a really short session.
No.
That was a long, long session.
Right.
The same thing happened with the income tax year, and there have been several years along the way where we've been in session for almost an entire year.
So looking towards this new long session, if that term still applies, but any particular, looking forward to that period of time, what do you think of the significant issues that might be brought forward, legislative, besides the budget? I mean, the budget is always there, and it's
Right.
always like almost issue number one, but I'm just curious about other issues that you might think, or you're hearing might be raised.
Well, there was a relatively recent U.S. Supreme Court decision relating to sports betting. That relates to the budget, but it's also something that could conceivably be thought of as a separate issue, because sports betting, which has been illegal in Connecticut. Now the court has basically ruled that you can have sports betting. States can do
Okay.
that. And the result of that then is that other states are getting into it, and people view this as an opportunity for Connecticut to both get some more money, and sports betting will presumably involve some development of some kind of sports
Right.
betting industry in Connecticut, and so there's going to be a push to do sports betting. From what I'm reading, I mean, was sort of lurking around in the background and everywhere. It was kind of almost going to happen, or at least almost going to come forward for a debate, was the issue of legalizing recreational marijuana. I think
Okay.
that there's a pretty good chance that that will be considered because, again, the change in partisan composition, the addition of some people for whom this is a high priority issue.
Okay.
I think that that's going to come up. I think also there's going to be some serious looking at our political process. That people are talking about the public financing, and when you look at it, you had a state senate candidate in Greenwich who was a self-funder who spent $280,000 for a state senate candidate campaign. Now in Connecticut, the most you can really spend is something like $110,000 if you go through the public financing. So
Mhm.
clearly you have people who are spending
Almost
2-3 times as much. There was one in eastern Connecticut, a person who won there, and not to be partisan about it, but both of these individuals were Democrats that
Okay.
spent these huge amounts of money. There was a person who spent $400,000 in a run for state senate, and he won. Very narrow, it was a recount to get to the point of winning, but he was able to win that seat. So pretty clearly, the issue of public financing and campaign financing and that sort of thing, I think is part of it. And then there's another issue, and that is that both parties had a lot of primaries. And I think when you look at how much time and effort is put into doing conventions,
Yeah.
if you're going to have a primary anyway,
Right.
really does it make any sense to continue doing these conventions, at least the way we have been doing them in the past? And I think a lot of people are raising questions about how the political process itself works
Okay.
and produces the results that it produces, because we have public financing in Connecticut. We're one of the very few states that has that for governor, for a statewide, spend millions of dollars available to run for governor. And the two candidates who ran were multi-millionaires who self-financed their campaigns.
Right.
So that raises a question as to, okay, so what are we doing here with this public
Right.
financing? Because we had a whole bunch of other people who raised huge amounts of money to try to qualify, and then some of them did qualify, and then they spent a lot of this money, and who are the ultimate winners of this enterprise?
People outside the system.
People outside of that whole system. And in
Right.
the Republican Party's case, people who didn't even go to the convention were among the top candidates running in the primary. And I'm guessing that if Ned Lamont had chosen to run as a primary and just skipped the Democratic convention, he might very well have been able to be successful
Anyway.
in that process.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of issues that I think people are going to want to talk
Any
about.
issues related to seniors that you're here bubbling around, or?
Well, the things that obviously are important to people relate to in some cases they relate to Medicaid, and there are issues about health care that obviously are important to people. I don't think there are any really big changes that would relate
Okay.
to senior citizens that I'm hearing about right now. That doesn't mean something isn't going to come up. I mean, there is going to be some sort of an effort, for example, to deal with the minimum wage, I'm pretty sure.
Mhm.
Uh,
I hear that.
there may be, that's one of those issues that I think gets a lot of attention, but it probably ultimately has a much lower impact on most people than the amount of attention it gets. But it's one of those issues that is probably going to come
Right.
up. So if you're a senior citizen and you're working someplace at a job, maybe the minimum wage might come up, because if you're doing something and it may be a part-time type of job that so if the minimum wage kicks in, that might change things for people. Either the job gets eliminated or somebody gets more money, something like that.
Now, for residents who, when I walk around, most people seem to know more about national issues than state issues, and I have a feeling you'd agree with that. If you
Yes.
chose
yes.
10 people randomly in Southbury, they'd know more about what's happening in Washington than Hartford. But if people want to have more insight into the legislative session and how things are going and moving in one direction or another. Any tips for them of what you would
Yeah.
suggest
Yeah,
to keep track?
There's two or three things that you can do pretty easily. One of them is that we have the Connecticut Television Network, CT-N.
Right.
And it runs in, now I'm not sure if it's available in the village. I
think-
hope that it is.
I think it is, yes.
I know that it's basically cable company by cable company and distributor by distributor.
I'll try to put the cable channel on the
Right.
screen here. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, so that covers gavel to gavel sessions in the legislature, the House and the Senate. Covers many, though by no means all of the committees. You know, they can only do a couple of committees per day.
Right.
So there might be Judiciary Committee on one day and the Appropriations Committee on a different day. So it won't cover any one committee all the way through from the beginning to the end of the session. But it covers many of the committees, so you can get certainly a flavor for what's going on. And frequently high-profile issues will get attention. So if there is a proposal, let's say, to do sports betting, and it's going to be in, and I'm not sure which committee, I guess it would be the Public Safety Committee, because gambling-related things go to public safety. If they have a big hearing on that, it will almost certainly be broadcast on CTN. Then you can go to CTN on the internet. They have archives of all kinds of things. So you can look up past sessions, past committee hearings and meetings and that sort of thing. So if you know what you're looking for, if you want to see what happened, you can go on the internet and just punch in CT-N. I mean, there are other things that use those letters, but you can find the one that's the Connecticut Broadcasting Network that covers Connecticut. And this is like C-SPAN for state
Right. And
legislature.
it would have potentially, upcoming sessions this week, so you could see
Yeah, they
what
will
they're
give you-
planning on recording.
Right. they
So
will
if
give you a
sports
preview.
betting is your thing, you could see, on Thursday, there's gonna be
A hearing
hearing.
on this, right.
Okay.
You can also go to CTCGA. Again, you can log that into your search engine, and you can go to the Connecticut General Assembly's website.
Right.
And it's not the easiest thing to navigate, but it's not that bad. And you can find, for example, information about committees. So you can look at the bills that have been proposed in a committee. You can look up legislators. You can go to your individual legislator and click on the bills that they have introduced or amendments that they have sponsored or co-sponsored. You can look up voting records. You can look up things that are like reports about legislation that are issued by our staff.
Okay.
We have a research staff. They do a very good job. We have an Office of Fiscal Analysis. They have a lot of reports about issues. Things like there was this study that was done about efficiency there are many of them, but the most recent one that Jim Smith of Webster Bank was involved with. It's still sort of ongoing as a private group, but the report is online. Lots of things, information that you can read, and you will find out what's going on or has gone on in the legislature, or what's likely to go. They have projections of major issues that are going to be considered. There's an orientation type of program that the legislature runs for incoming new legislators, and anybody can go to it that is any legislator, and they frequently have all of the data for that.
Okay.
And CTN might even have a video of that because it's happening before the session really gets going.
Okay.
So there are lots of resources that are readily available online that you can get a hold of. And if there's something in particular that you're looking for, you can call my office, which is 1-800.
It's okay.
Yeah, 1-800-842-1423. It's an 800 number, toll free, that you can call. And if you ask for Representative O'Neill, you'll probably get my aide, because I'm not normally sitting there waiting for the phone to ring. And if you have a question, you can do that. We have an online contact form that you can go online if you check, or again,
We'll
search
put
for
that
me.
website too.
You can have access to getting a hold of me that way. If you have a question or an issue or a problem, you can contact me that way. And people can contact me by email. All of that information can be gleaned by either contacting the office by phone or going online. You can find lots of ways to get a hold of the legislators, myself as well as other legislators.
Well, let me just put in a plug that I think you always welcome visitors, but if they do go to Hartford, I would put a plug in for the tour of the state capitol, which I think starts at the Legislative Office Building.
Right, we frequently have-
Excellent tour of the history
Mhm.
of that building and to some degree Connecticut. Well worth the time.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, one of the things that, when I've been up there and it's been summertime or something, and I go to a committee meeting that's off the regular session, I will bump into people who are visiting. Sometimes they're from in-state, many times they're from out of state. And I will give them a little sort of cook's tour of the legislature and the LOB if I have a few minutes to give them that. But there is a tour. It's run by the League of Women Voters. They usually do organized groups of some sort. I think occasionally groups do come up from the village. High school students and junior high school students and even fourth graders not uncommonly come up as part of their school activities as well. So we get a lot of visitors that come and they can sit in the gallery. Anyone can just come. You don't need to get permission to go into the legislature's gallery, and you can watch what's going on in person. What's happening in the House or the Senate, or come to the committee meetings and just sit in the audience.
Well, I really appreciate your time. We've gone a little longer than expected, but I think that's because you had a lot of good information to impart and some good stories too about the past. So again, thank you for stopping by, and a pleasure to talk to you. And for our viewers out there, please stay tuned to future editions of On the Town, where we'll have the opportunity to talk to more leaders who are making Southbury a great place to live.